welcome back everybody to the next part of the Master's Class lecture on colonial rule in Southeast Asia. So to kick things off, we have this conflict that's going on primarily in the Caribbean, but it starts to spill over into the Southeast Asian world. With the advent of all these revolutions in the Latin American world, basically the old remnants of the Spanish Empire and their colonial control, it begins to sort of spill over into Southeast Asia, and America actually gets involved. This is due to a couple of reasons. One is that with these Latin American revolutions, President Monroe at the time, time of course goes on since Monroe's presidency, but he had declared the Monroe Doctrine, which was basically just this idea that if any foreign or independent power was trying to interfere with the self-determination and the development of any of the territories that could be considered the Americas or in its immediate sphere of influence, then as a last resort, America would come to the aid, militarily speaking, of that country to help with its ability to rebel, to revolt, to seek independence, self-determination. And with all these Latin American revolutions, the Spanish Empire was weakening, they're losing control. They're considered, by and large, by the other European powers at this time, to be kind of weak. But the same perception could be said of the United States. I mean, by 1898, I should say prior to 1898, but not too far off, 1896 even, you even have this perception. There's an Italian newspaper that even says that, these European powers need to be worried about America. Like, everyone's sleeping on the United States, and it's a foolish thing to do, because one day there will come a great, what he calls, this writer of this Italian newspaper, the Great American Peril. He sort of envisioned, this Italian journalist, that America would rise up as one of the most, if not the most, preeminent superpower, kind of foreshadowing what a lot of the rest of the world, I should say, really wasn't able to perceive at the time. And it's with the Spanish-American War that perceptions are going to radically change and start to shift. So it starts really in the 1600s, the 1500s and the 1600s, with the earliest encomienda systems that the Spanish set up. They have the system known as the reducción system, and they're also called reconcentration camps in Cuba. And this is where the conflict really starts to begin, when the Cubans seek independence. The U.S. is going to use this as a pretext to get involved, to help the Cubans obtain their independence. And from there, and the reducción system is basically just the rounding up of the native peoples of a territory that a colonizer controls. And we kind of learned this a while back. They set up, churches and parishes and cathedrals. They set up more European-style towns and villages for them to live in. And basically, this is a way for the colonizing forces to control the labor of the native people that they have colonized, to mass baptize, something else the Spanish do, in an attempt to Christianize them. I remember that, idea to, save the heathen masses. This is a very popular line of rhetoric at this time, the white man's burden, that is sort of justifying these predominantly white European powers in their colonization efforts, to justify them. So they start to rebel. They start to seek independence. The Cubans do it with, of course, the aid of the United States. And once Cuba is able to do this, the Philippines will seek to emulate the success that the Cubans had seen. And now the conflict spills over into the Southeast Asian world. Not too far off from Hawaii, this is a way that the Americans can, maybe get a foothold, convenient access to trade with China and start to become a major player in the Southeast Asian world. It's also a way for them to prevent the area from falling into the hands of the Japanese, who, if we're going to talk about Southeast Asian colonization, the Japanese are the only successful Asian nation to become a colonizing, competing force against powers like the United States and certainly the other collective European powers, Britain, France, etc. So William McKinley decides that it's time to aid the Philippines. President William McKinley, it's a moral obligation to civilize this part of the world along with other parts. In fact, William McKinley says something to the effect of, well, there is nothing left for us to do but to uplift the Filipino and to Christianize them. Well, I mean, the Spanish had already been doing that for centuries, the whole Christian thing, and they're really not keen on being controlled or heavily influenced by yet another outside force. So the Spanish, being very weak, are defeated by Commodore George Dewey, and the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay is essentially destroyed. And this is going to lead to a treaty of Paris. Paris, France, France being one of the preeminent military powers at this time. Obviously a heavy influencer and colonization force in Southeast Asia. A lot of peace treaties get signed through France. They control a lot of international diplomatic relations. It just makes sense. And it's there, though, that something that doesn't make sense happens. You see, during the Spanish-American War, when it was just the Filipinos versus the Spanish, General Emilio Aguinaldo is a leader for the movement of independence in the Philippines. He leads this guerrilla force. He kind of goes into exile in 1898 when things aren't looking so great against the Spanish, but he continues to lead the sort of, guerrilla warfare tactics, attacking from the jungles, trying to free native Filipinos from the reducción camps, or the reconcentration camps, if you will, where they're sort of housed and they're kept an eye on by the Spanish authorities. And then, after the United States has swept in and helped aid the Filipinos, the Treaty of Paris states that the Philippines will be essentially controlled and given over to the United States and not recognize the established republic of the Philippines. So Emilio Aguinaldo is going to set himself up as president of the Republic of the Philippines. They are going to deny the United States having control and supreme authority over the ability of the Filipinos to self-determine what kind of government they're going to run. And this is kind of like a bitter slap, because this is so unlike Cuba and what happened there. We have a president that can mirror the president of the United States. The Republic of the Philippines. This would seem to extol the virtues that the United States claimed that they were helping the Filipinos to gain by rebelling against the Spanish in their fight for independence. So now, for another brief conflict, the United States will be at war with the Philippines, as they now have to fight bitterly using the same tactics that they used against the Spanish, but now against their former U.S. allies, so they can establish their independence. This fighting resulted in a 3-year bloody warfare. The United States, of course, eventually defeats the guerrilla forces. They were battle-hardened. You can say they're even veterans by the time that the United States enters the scene, and they fight against them, but so too are the U.S. troops. And now, if we can see from the image here, we see the depiction of the United States troops, and we see the depiction of the Filipinos as they rebel. Well, you know, of course they rebel, as they once again are fighting for independence. And you can probably tell from the artistic expression here that, you know, we're seeing more features of the Filipinos, you know, this sort of gritty need to fight for independence, the adoption of sort of Western military garb and tactics, whereas the United States troops are kind of darkened out, they're shadowy, they're this weird force in the background that just seemingly has all this control, this authority, this power. And it sort of sets up, artistically speaking, and here's just an image of Emilio Aguinaldo, if we can see. And it sort of sets up this imagery here, this notion that for the average, you know, the average Southeast Asian who is, you know, living through in their rural lifestyle, through colonization, that this is probably what these colonizing forces in the military that represent them sort of look like. They're kind of there, but we don't really see them as people because, well, clearly they don't really see us as people, merely as a means to an end, this sort of shadowy force in the background that seems to determine our fate. And if we go to another primary source, we can see right here from Senator Albert Beveridge from a speech before the U.S. Senate on January 9th, 1900, at the turn of the 20th century. He says, quote, this would be to President McKinley, "Mr. President, the times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not abandon opportunity in Asia. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race." And so this goes back once again to the social Darwinist and racist elements that exist when it comes to colonization during this era, the white man's burden and social Darwinism set forth by Herbert Spencer. By our race, trustee under God. So this is, once again, a divine right. The United States has a divine right to bring the American way to the rest of the world as a means to civilize it. So yeah, the roots for colonization are deep. They're deep in divine, this sense of, you know, divine right. They're deep in survival of the fittest. This is a natural course of evolution. They're deep in racist elements. So when it comes to the colonial regimes that are being established, we've gone over, of course, the chief goal is to exploit the people, especially in areas with a massive population, because labor becomes cheap, and then we exploit the natural resources of those lands to open up. Let's move on. So we have these markets, right? Natural resources that are being exploited. We're trying to obtain cheap physical labor to exploit the local populace. Large tracts of land, once colonized, are being sort of brought up to become collective plantation agricultural style systems. So if you were, you know, a fairly decent or wealthy independent rice farmer, you had, you know, a sizable plot of land, you might have all that repossessed, and you might be, you know, out of luck. And this became very difficult for, there are fewer economic opportunities now that existed as a result of colonization under these regimes for people who used to have, you know, more charitable or equitable access to land. And this is a big aspect because, let's be honest, the majority of Southeast Asia during this time, much like other places in the world that we've seen, is agriculturally based in their economies. So once power is seized, there really, besides becoming a protectorate where the country that is colonized is essentially controlled by the colonizing power, and they're kind of like militarily protected. If anyone makes any decision against you that goes against our colonizing interests, then we will go to war with that nation. And so that's basically drawing your line in the sand. But there are other ways to actually rule and control once you've taken control over a colony. And so we have two methods. One, we see indirect rule. This is very popular under the Dutch East Indies. So when we get into the areas under their control in Southeast Asia, we can refer back to our map right here. In Indonesia, they did not have the language. They did not have the resistances to some of the diseases that were prevalent in these regions. They didn't know the culture, the customs. And so it makes sense to use indirect rule, which is basically just local rulers who are allowed to keep their authority and status in this new colonial setting. It's a way to even elevate certain individuals who decide, you know what, the colonizing thing can be really profitable. And so they become buddy-buddy with the new colonizing forces, these sort of local authorities, these rulers, because it makes sense for them financially to do so. Not resist the tide, but go with it. And this, of course, makes access to the region's natural resources that much easier because the people are still essentially being, in their mind, ruled over, controlled, policed by people that look like them, that know their culture, their customs. They speak the language. And it's cheaper because fewer officials had to be trained. And it's less disruptive to local culture. Now, if that doesn't work, for whatever reason, and there are many reasons why this system would not work, this could be because some local elites resist foreign conquest. They will not be controlled. They will not be puppet rulers. They lead peasant uprisings. They turn the influential authorities of society against the colonizing forces. Well, in that case, they can be replaced. And in this case, by Western officials. So people who then have to be trained. They have to ideally understand the local culture, the customs, to learn to speak the language. And this is expensive. This is time exhaustive. And this is direct rule. So this is when officials are brought in from the colonizing country to rule, to control. So we see this with Great Britain. They sort of administered Burma directly through its colonial government in India, which is right next to Burma. Indochina, we see both systems that the French use, north and south, and imposes direct rule in southern Vietnam, but rules directly through the emperor in northern Vietnam. And now, wherever you go, now that you have amongst the elites of society who typically sign in, right? They are indirect rulers for the colonizing force. Their children now have access to Western education. They can go overseas. So if you're in Vietnam, you might go to France and to the University of Paris. If you were in Burma or India, you might become educated at, Oxford or Cambridge and then return home. And as a result of this, their idea here is that they're gonna, take over for dad. They can take over for the family member. They can rise to a position of authority and power as an indirect ruler themselves to represent their government with the blessings of Western civilization. But there was also a caveat, and many Westerners came to fear the idea of these individuals who received these Western-style educations because when the native peoples become educated and they understand the political rights that exist elsewhere in the world, they might fight against the system. And we're going to see elements of that as well. People who recognize what the colonial economy really is once they get into the more industrialized world that has colonized them. So they see that the colonists are not able to really develop their own industries, such as people who are in France or in England or even the United States are able to do. They see the sort of independence that is being prevented as there's a major emphasis on the exportation of these raw materials from their nations, their natural raw materials, and trying to keep them dependent on manufactured goods produced elsewhere. They see the plantation agriculture system is like the de facto policy. Peasants work as wage laborers on foreign-owned plantations, part of these plantations that used to belong to the native peoples of Southeast Asia. And they see them keeping these, these plantation workers at poverty levels so that the plantation owners can increase their profits. And of course, because of this tremendous burden economically and physically, thousands die. And as always, it will be the peasant who bears the burden of high taxes. But if you saw all this and you're one of these educated elites, you see your people working as children in these terrible conditions, what makes you okay with this system? What makes this justifiable to you? Well, could be that you seem to reap the benefits that Western civilization provides. So we can see from this image from Cambodia, Western style carriage, the king who is fully in system with the French, who is signed off with the French, who acts as an indirect ruler. You can see his son, the prince, sitting next to him. And we see his carriage drivers dressed in French-style military garb. We see this sort of man commanding his post nearby, also in French-style military garb. They've bought into the system. They bought in because they see some of the benefits that are being brought to Southeast Asia, and they, of course, are on the forefront of those benefits. So the railroads, the highways, other structures that benefit native lives, the technology that's being brought in, they benefit. Of course, they can roll out tolls and taxes on these things, which they can collect and pocket as they see fit. So the development of an export market helped to create an entrepreneurial class where it existed, few and far between, mind you, in rural areas. And I'll give you an example in a moment here of one such individual who is denied opportunity but finds it in other arenas. So in the Dutch East Indies, for example, small growers were able to, if they somehow pocketed enough money, saved up, found an opportunity, knew the right person, able to secure their own plot of land, they could get into the very lucrative rubber game. And so for France, we see rubber being exported back to France for companies like Michelin Tires, which is still a massive company and very well known internationally today. Palm oil, of course, coffee, tea, spices. They can begin to share in the profits of colonial enterprise, where these commodities maybe weren't as profitable prior to colonization. Now they show immense value once shipped overseas to these Western powers. And now let's get to resistance, because resistance is the name of the game here. I mean, if you're not with us, you're against us. And do you buy in to colonization or not? There's rarely any middle ground to be had here, and I'll show you I'll show you one great example of this. So when we get into France, right, into Vietnam, I should say, in the French control. So you have, indirect rule in the south, and in the north, I'm sorry, yeah. So in the south of Vietnam, if we can just go back really quick, we can see that we do have, this system where southern Vietnam was ruled indirectly through the emperor, but not everybody signs up for that. So you have one group, and this is where you can see resistance begin to form. A number of government officials, the military, they refuse to recognize the legitimacy of France without the emperor's help. All right, so they fought France without the emperor's help because they see that the emperor is basically kind of controlled by the French. They actually want to instill a boy king onto the throne. And of course, there's a reason for why you would probably want to do that, why you resist against the French, especially putting a boy king on the throne. The biggest rationale of this, of course, is that the boy king could be influenced by these government officials to maybe instill aspects that are more aligned to their cultural identity. And this is where national politics and national identity starts to really play a factor here. These elements of national identity, it used to be before colonization that, there's your local culture, you identify with the times that you occupy in the area around you. But all of a sudden, once you have this outside force that rules over you, now there are certain elements that continue to rise up. So, we start to develop in Southeast Asia these sort of identity politics, these national identities that begin to emerge against the backdrop of colonization. You now know what you are and what you are not. What does it mean to actually be Vietnamese? Now, that's a question that someone in Vietnam might not have had to really answer or even consider prior to colonization. What does it actually mean? Like, what are the cultural identity markers that make me and me a representative of my culture? What are we and what aren't we? So this fails, Can Vuong. It ultimately fails in their resistance, and there are grisly images that you'll find all over the internet to show the failure of resistance to these colonizing forces, and you can see elements of them everywhere. Now, you also have a new emerging group. So yes, you have groups that are made of government officials and the military, and therefore you would have to assume they had access to some semblance of education, particularly within their own system prior to colonization, even during colonization. Then you have groups, as we've mentioned, who maybe they're the sons or daughters of independent, indirect rulers, I should say, not independent, but indirect rulers. And I just want to actually go back one really quick. So they would receive, as I mentioned, an education overseas, Western style education. And although they continue to dress in their garb and they gain a greater appreciation for their national identity as it begins to emerge, but they also slightly, ever more presently, become increasingly westernized, adopting the garb, the education, the traits of the places that they go. As they receive their education, they buy in. But not everyone buys in. And we're going to talk about this guy, Saya-san, who is just an incredible, individual, someone very much of the times, in my opinion. So Saya-san is not Western educated, but he will be influenced and will influence those individuals who are educated, who are westernized, in a resistance against colonialization. He lives a very interesting life. Rice was a big cash crop in Burma, especially after colonization. But with colonization came, once again, these massive plantations. So there was less opportunity to actually get in on the profits of the rice gain if you were Burmese. So he goes outside of his village to sell mats. He's going to become a mat maker. So you can sit on these mats in the home of your village. And that doesn't seem to pan out either for him. So he pivots into being a carpenter. And from carpentry, he sees some success. Timber's also a big raw profit for sure that you can obtain. And so from that, he's going to pivot once more into something far more lucrative: fortune telling and traditional medicine. And he gained a lot of success as a fortune teller and someone who practices traditional medicine, especially because in its own way, it's a form of rebellion against Western style medicine, which he writes a couple treatises against. And so after he does this, he starts to pivot into politics. And it's here that we see this new kind of resistance based on nationalism that really begins to emerge. So you have individuals who speak Western style languages, they're connected to Western style jobs, they are Western educated, but they're trying to lead resistance, and they need individuals like Saya-san, who is very steeped in his culture and his community. So you have in Burma students at the University of Rangoon who form student organizations like the Young Men's Buddhist Association, which will eventually bleed into other larger, greater, more well-funded organizations that Saya-san is going to become very much affiliated with. One such organization that he's going to become affiliated with is going to be responsible in large part for helping him to proclaim himself as king. And so he'll become this king. He's going to form an army known as the Garuda army or the Galan army, basically based off of a fabulous bird of Hindu mythology. And the idea here is to expel the British, not just to protest against the British for their arrogance and their failure to observe local customs and Buddhist temples, which Saya San is very much for, because he kind of makes this transition from fortune teller to traditional physician to essentially Buddhist monk and astrologer. And he is seen as having a kind of power, Saya San, where he can basically tattoo charms on the bodies of his followers, which he claims will make them invulnerable to the bullets from the Maxim guns, the machine guns, from the firearms of the British. Well, they are going to protest and fight back against what they believe is official persecution of the Buddhist religion, and ultimately they are going to fail. So what winds up happening is that he will be captured, Saya San, and he will be executed and hanged along with about 120 of his other rebel followers. But the rebellion will actually last for another 2 years. So it's here in the 1930s where you see rebellions like Saya San's really start to play out against British colonialism and their resistance to it. So you have someone who's of the people, who represents their religion, speaks their language, who upholds local customs, but is kind of steered by these Western educated students outside the University of Rangoon, and ultimately tries to establish Burmese national identity politics. And this is where, resistance really plays out. It's often led by these educated elites who rally the peasantry like Saya San did, because Saya San is the face of these, often angry peasants. All right, that'll do it for us. See you next time.